"Wearing a uniform doesn't make you a real soldier," snarled Lieutenant Brent Keller as he yanked the black woman out of her car in the middle of the street. His baton struck her face. Blood splattered across the windshield, but she didn't cry, didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her epaulette. He had no idea he had just assaulted a United States Army Major General, a decorated commander of elite forces with special operations honors. The entire incident was captured on camera. The slap, the humiliation, the cold silence. And just hours later, America erupted. She never had to speak. He collapsed on his own. So if that happened right in front of you, would you stay silent or take a stand? The morning sun was already unforgiving, casting stark, overexposed shadows across the concrete. Heat shimmered off windshields and pavement alike, but the air was still. A patrol cruiser slowed near the intersection of Beach and 9th, tires hissing as it came to a halt beside a black sedan idling too long at the curb. Officer Brent Keller stepped out with a look carved from disdain and superiority. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his cap as he approached the driver's window. Tap, tap, tap. His knuckles met the glass with authority, not inquiry. The woman behind the wheel didn't flinch. She was a black woman, mid-40s, calm and composed. Her uniform, a perfectly pressed U.S. military dress outfit, was as precise as her stillness. A faint sheen of sweat beaded on her brow, but she didn't speak. She just looked ahead, hands resting firmly at 10 and 2. "You're obstructing traffic," Brent barked. The woman blinked once but said nothing. "License and registration?" Still, she didn't respond immediately. Her hand moved slowly, methodically, reaching toward the glove compartment. Brent's jaw tightened. He stepped back, glanced down at her uniform again, and sneered. "What is this, huh?" he snapped. "Some kind of costume party?" He leaned forward, eyes boring into her like a spotlight. "You think that little jacket makes you somebody?" His voice was raised now, sharp, aggressive, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed but didn't intervene. The woman turned her head, her eyes, dark and still, locked onto his. They didn't waver, didn't blink, didn't reflect fear or confusion or anger. Just stillness, a depthless silence that unsettled Brent more than any protest would have. She looked through him. That look, unmoved, unreadable, triggered something primal. Brent's nostrils flared. "You hear me?" he shouted, slamming his hand down on the top of the car. "I asked you a question." The woman didn't answer. She simply adjusted her posture, straightening the line of her jacket with a small, precise movement. Not defiant, not submissive, just composed. Brent stepped back again, reaching for his baton. A second of silence stretched like taut wire between them, then it snapped. With one sudden, brutal motion, he yanked open the driver's side door. "Out of the car!" His voice was no longer controlled. It was sharp and cracking with rage. "I said out!" He grabbed her by the arm. She moved as little as necessary, complying not out of fear, but out of control. Her boots hit the pavement softly, still no words. Her eyes met his again. That was the final insult. Brent, flushed red with humiliation and something deeper, something old and unresolved, drew back his arm and swung. The baton cracked across her face with a sickening snap. Blood sprayed across the windshield, a vivid slash of red on the clean glass. She staggered back a step, knees bending slightly, body folding, then catching itself. She went down on one knee, steadying herself with one hand. A breath caught in the air. The onlookers gasped, but no one moved. Her blood dripped slowly onto the pavement, painting small, blooming stains. She reached up, wiped nothing away. Instead, she stood, straightened, her face, smeared with red, remained completely impassive. She reached up with one gloved hand and calmly adjusted the collar of her uniform, resetting it precisely to regulation position. Brent's breath was ragged. His baton still shook in his hand. He stared at her, expecting something, screaming, pleading, anything human, but she gave him none of it. That silence, it crushed him. She looked him dead in the eye, not a muscle twitching, not a hint of fear. The blood still streamed slowly down her temple, tracing the line of her jaw, staining the fabric where it met skin. Behind her, the sun continued to rise, casting a golden halo behind her silhouette. The light caught in the curve of her badge. It gleamed for a moment before the blood dulled it. Brent's voice came out cracked. "You don't scare me," he growled, more to himself than to her. She didn't flinch. Her breathing remained calm, deliberate. The eyes, those goddamn eyes, held him in place like he was the one in handcuffs. Around them, the street buzzed in a strange low hum of tension. People had gathered now, silent, phones in hand. Not a word passed between them, but the air was loaded, electric with judgment. Brent felt it but couldn't place it. All he could see was her face, battered, bloodied, but unbowed. That was the part that stung, that refusal to acknowledge his power, his uniform, his authority. None of it bent her. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, stepping closer again. She remained still. Only her eyes followed him. He couldn't look at them anymore. He looked at her boots instead, polished, immaculate. His reflection stared back at him in their shine, distorted by the red drip just below. "Say something," he said, low and shaky. "Say anything." She didn't. She just reached up again and adjusted the epaulet on her right shoulder, aligning it perfectly. Blood dripped from her chin as she moved, a quiet stream against the olive drab. The image seared itself into every camera lens recording nearby. The symmetry of her form, the disorder of the blood, the obscene juxtaposition of violence against composure. Then she stood, back straight, shoulders squared, and looked away from him. It was the most devastating thing she could have done. Brent stood frozen, baton slack in his grip, lips parted. He had no script for this, no manual to handle someone who didn't fight back, didn't plead, didn't even hate him out loud, just looked through him like he was already gone. For a few long seconds, the whole street seemed to fall under a silence so thick it pressed against the skin, and then someone far back in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God." That's when Brent realized what had just happened wasn't going to stay on this corner. This wasn't going to be one more outburst, swept under concrete and paperwork. There were too many eyes, too much blood, too much composure from the wrong kind of target. But still, she said nothing. Not a curse, not a word. She stood there, eyes forward, blood soaking slowly into the collar of her uniform, hands clenched at her sides with military precision, and Brent, he backed away, one slow step, then another. Because there are moments when silence says more than any courtroom ever could, moments when authority collapses under the weight of its abuse. And in that morning light on that unassuming street, Brent Keller felt for the first time that his badge didn't protect him, it condemned him. The blood hadn't dried yet. It trickled slowly down her jawline, catching the morning light as it curved into the fine lines of her uniform, soaking into the high collar that framed her unshaken face. Her silence still hung in the air like the echo of a siren long faded, and yet it was louder than Brent Keller could stand. That silence, it didn't break. It loomed. It judged. It dismantled. And Brent, chest heaving with the uneven rhythm of an ego-hemorrhaging power, was not done. No, he wouldn't let it end with a stare, not with that look still boring through him like a blade. He took a step closer, each bootfall sharper than the last. The eyes watching from across the street through phone lenses and shop windows had multiplied, but none dared speak. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the need to reclaim control that had slipped like sand through his fingers. His gaze locked on her chest, where her nameplate gleamed dully, stained now by the blood running from the corner of her mouth. Without a word, he reached forward and ripped the name tag from her uniform with a metallic screech that cut through the tension like a blade on steel. The sound was almost obscene in the silence that surrounded them. Then came the badge, silver, standard issue, gleaming beneath the drying blood. His fingers found it, and with a sharp jerk, he tore it free from her left breast. "This," he hissed, voice low, venomous, as he held the badge up between them like it was a prop in some grotesque courtroom drama. "This is nothing. A fake. A farce. You think this makes you someone? You think this gives you the right to stand there and look down on me?" His lips curled. "You're dressed up like a soldier, but you're just another imposter in a costume." She stood still, that same unbearable stillness, not a flinch, not a wince, just a quiet breath through her nose as blood dripped slowly down the line of her neck, seeping into the fibers like ink into parchment. Her hands were at her sides, unclenched, unmoved. Her eyes rose to meet his, not pleading, not fighting, watching. Brent took one slow, deliberate step back. He held the badge in front of him as if weighing its worth in his palm. Then, with the theatricality of a man convinced the world revolved around his authority, he flung it to the asphalt. It landed with a hollow metallic clatter, spinning once before settling face up in a puddle of her blood. He didn't hesitate. One heavy boot came down. Crack! The badge gave a weak, metallic protest under his weight, bending slightly, scraping against the pavement. Again. He ground it down with a fury born not of duty, but of humiliation. "Thurojia Mao," he spat through gritted teeth. His voice dripped with contempt, but it was the hollow kind, the kind that echoes off steel walls and returns smaller each time. What he didn't notice was the red LED light blinking across the street. A small security camera, mounted above the awning of a dry cleaner's shop, had caught the entire thing. Unblinking, impartial, damning, the footage rolled on. Blood on asphalt, badge underfoot, the cold theater of unprovoked cruelty performed in the full light of day. But Brent wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about dominance, about the aching need to erase the look in her eyes. And yet, he couldn't, because when he finally looked up from the mangled emblem at his feet, she was still looking at him, her chin lifted slightly, neck streaked with crimson, spine unbent. Her eyes held him with the quiet gravity of a person who had faced worse and would endure longer. There was no hate in them, no fear, not even anger, only the unspoken verdict of a soldier who knew exactly what power looked like and knew this wasn't it. She didn't move to pick up the badge. She didn't react to the insult. She let it lie there, broken, in her blood, as though its destruction meant nothing to her, but everything to the man who had crushed it. Her silence became a mirror, and Brent saw the reflection of something ugly staring back. He breathed through his nose, chest still tight, but some part of him, some small, shrinking part, felt the hollowness of what he had done. The badge wasn't a victory. It wasn't even a weapon. It was a symbol. And he hadn't stripped her of honor. He had exposed his bankruptcy. The woman didn't speak. Not then, not when the crowd finally murmured, nor when a woman across the street whispered to her child. She didn't even flinch, not even when the buzz of recording phones whispered through the air like digital insects. She stood as though sculpted from resolve, as though pain and pride had fused into something immovable. The smear of blood on her temple gleamed in the light, a crimson slash against the rigid lines of her uniform. Brent turned, his hand still curled around the now empty space where her nameplate had once been. There was sweat pooling at the back of his neck. His badge suddenly felt heavier on his chest, as if it, too, knew it no longer meant what he thought it did. Across the street, behind glass, the shop camera blinked on, recording, remembering, rendering judgment. And she, still silent, still upright, remained untouched in spirit, though her face bore the evidence of everything he had done. Her blood was real, her uniform was real, her silence louder than any badge, any rank, any name. Brent Keller had stomped on a symbol, but the real weight, the thing pressing now against his lungs, was not the metal under his boot. It was the knowledge, slow, creeping, inescapable, that he hadn't broken her. He had only revealed himself. The badge was still bleeding in the street when the footage hit the timeline. 19 seconds. That's all it took to gut the illusion of authority, to shatter the shield of silence that usually protected men like Brent Keller. The camera hadn't flinched. It had watched from across the street, high above the dry cleaner's door, catching every movement in crystal clarity, her stillness, his violence, the moment the badge met the pavement, and the louder moment when when it cracked under his boot. The video began with a slap and ended with a stare. It was perfect in its horror, devastating in its truth. The clip was uploaded at 8:33 a.m. Eastern. By 8:17, it was viral. By 8:31, it had a hashtag, "Who is she?" Phones lit up in subway stations. Screens froze in offices mid-Gmail. The world didn't blink. It watched. Watched her rise, blood soaking her cheek, uniform stained but precise. Watched her face, stern, unreadable. Stared not just at Brent, but into the lens, past it, straight through the soul of a country addicted to punishment but allergic to accountability. No words, just her eyes. That was enough. Brent didn't know yet. He was still pacing, still angry, still high off the stench of domination. He didn't see the wave. He didn't feel the shift. The web pulsed like a struck nerve. Comments poured in like artillery fire. Who is she? What the hell did I just watch? She didn't even blink. Why is she so calm? Where is her voice? Where is justice? And in between those questions, tears. People wept as they typed, some silently, some with shaking hands, the kind of crying that comes not from a singular pain but from recognition of patterns, of repetition, of the same damn story playing out again and again, with different names but the same brutal ending, except this one didn't end with a scream, it ended with silence. And that, somehow, was worse. Journalists didn't wait. They clipped the video down to tight bursts. 17 seconds, 14, 11. Each version is sharper, more surgical. The slap, the badge, the stomp, the stare. Cut, repeat, zoom, hashtag loop. It was chaos, but not the kind that feels messy. It was the kind of chaos that breathes intention. This wasn't a glitch. It was a system cracking. Brent's name wasn't even in the caption yet. He was still anonymous, but she had become a myth in real time. People didn't need to know her name to know she was more than the uniform, more than the blood. She was defiant in stillness, power without volume, and it terrified people, especially the ones used to being feared. At 8:39, a user posted a slowed-down version of the final frame. She's standing upright, hands cuffed behind her back, shoulders squared, the trail of blood vivid across her jaw. Her eyes stare directly into the camera. The caption reads, "She got hit, she got cuffed, but she's the only one standing like a soldier." It gets 12,000 retweets in 7 minutes. At 8:43, someone else records a man on the sidewalk, one of the witnesses. He's crying, hand shaking, phone pressed against his chest like it's radioactive. "I don't know who she is," he sobs, "but I've never seen anything like that." She looked at him like he was the one being arrested, and he wasn't wrong, because something was chilling in that gaze. Not rage, not vengeance, just the truth. Cold, exacting, devastating truth. It was the look of someone who had already buried 1,000 moments like this, and chose, this time, to show the world what it looked like when dignity refused to bleed. Brent still hadn't seen it, but the world had. The digital tidal wave was coming, and when it hit, it wouldn't just take down a man, it would take down a story. The myth that a uniform alone made someone righteous. A woman in Kansas posted the clip with a caption, "My son saw this, he asked if she was a superhero. I said yes." A man in New Jersey posted, "I'm a vet. I know that look. That's what courage under fire looks like." And someone in Los Angeles just said, "This is the moment the country changes. Mark it." By 9:02, it had hit national news cycles. But it didn't need anchors. The people were already speaking, not with pitchforks or slogans, just screenshots, reposts, echoes. Brent finally got the call at 9:07. Someone from Precinct Dispatch said only, "You might want to step off social media." His brows furrowed, annoyed more than alarmed. Then his phone buzzed, and didn't stop buzzing. He opened the feed, and there he was, frozen mid-magma, face twisted in fury, hand gripped around a badge not his. The angle was damning. The context was unmistakable. But it was her eyes, again, that pulled him under. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at all of them. For a moment, he thought the floor had tilted. He set his phone down, but the image burned behind his eyelids. Not the slap, not the stomp, the stare. People didn't need volume. They had clarity. They didn't need context. They had evidence. And what they had seen, they believed. Who is she trended at #1 globally by 9/21, but no one could answer yet. Not officially. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't identified herself. She hadn't made a statement. And that only made it worse for Brent, because every second she stayed silent, the louder the story grew. A million voices tried to speak on her behalf, but none of them carried the gravity of her quiet. It wasn't a submission. It wasn't fear. It was control. She had been cuffed, but she had never been contained. The final shot of the video played again, now captioned in a dozen languages. Her hands were bound, but she stood straighter than anyone. And as the comments rolled in like a second tidal wave, as the digital world erupted in analysis and tribute and awe, the badge Brent had crushed still lay in the street. Blood still dried along the gutter, the sun still rose, but faith in systems, in symbols, in men who wore power like a weapon, was collapsing like a scaffold kicked from underneath. And in the middle of it, a woman stood tall, saying nothing. And in the middle of it, a woman stood tall, saying nothing. And the world listened anyway. The clip hadn't finished its third viral loop before the call came in. In the precinct's operations room, beneath the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the faint chatter of dispatch radio, Chief Randall Hayworth was halfway through his second coffee when his line rang. Not the desk phone, the red one, the one that never rang unless something had gone horribly systemically wrong. He answered with the reflex of a man trained to brace for crisis but not for history. "Hayworth," he said flatly. "Stand by for encrypted relay," a voice on the other end barked, clipped and official. 3 seconds. Then the line clicked. "This is Colonel Shavers, Department of Defense Liaison. We have a code Red 5 in your jurisdiction. Confirm identity." The chief straightened. What? Code Red 5? That's not Angela V. Maddox. Rank, Major General, U.S. Army. Repeat, General Maddox has been physically assaulted by one of your officers. Code Red 5. High-value target. High clearance classification. You are ordered to cease all routine operations and hold all involved personnel. Defense oversight will be in contact within the hour. Hayworth's blood froze. His hand slipped. The phone hit the floor with a hollow thud, echoing across the tile like a dropped gavel. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Red 5. The term was rarely spoken. It wasn't a protocol. It was an earthquake, reserved for generals, nuclear site breaches, or active wartime incidents. This wasn't a complaint. This wasn't a scandal. This was an act of war on protocol itself. He leaned down, hand trembling, picked the receiver back up. "You said Maddox? General Maddox?" "Affirmative," Shavers replied. "You're now in breach of national military integrity. If she bleeds, the country bleeds. You get me?" "I get you." The line clicked off. That was it. No further explanation. No gentle lead-in. Just a name, a rank, and a code that told him everything he needed to know. Hayworth stood there for a full 10 seconds before he moved. His gaze shifted across the bullpen. He saw Brent Keller, still standing tall, smug, unaware. Unaware that the air had shifted, that his life had detonated behind the scenes in less time than it took to reload a clip. Hayworth walked toward him, the weight of history pressing on each footfall. Keller turned, sensing movement, eyes narrowed in habitual defiance. "Chief, what's going on?" Hayworth didn't blink. "You just hit a general," he said. Brent blinked, confused. "What?" "Not just any general," Hayworth snapped. "Angela V. Maddox. You hit Red 5? The words landed with the sharp precision of a sniper round. Brent's smirk faltered, confusion morphing into unease. "Red 5? What the hell does that even mean?" "It means," Hayward said, jaw locked, voice low and cold, "you didn't hit a civilian. You didn't hit a protester. You didn't hit a nuisance. You hit the spine of the United States military machine. You hit a name that doesn't answer to you or me or this whole goddamn city. You struck at the vertebrae of the command structure. Silence. Brent swallowed. His hands dropped to his sides. That's not possible, he muttered. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to, Hayworth barked. You think power needs to announce itself to you? You think someone like Maddox is going to start flailing her credentials to get you to back off? No, she lets your ignorance dig your grave, and you just dug it down to hell. Brant shook his head. No, she didn't look like a general. She didn't even speak. That's what makes her dangerous, Hayworth said. She didn't have to. She just stood there and let you indict yourself. 18 cameras, 19 seconds, and a name that outranks every inch of your existence. Brant's face paled. The arrogance, the anger, it drained from him like someone had pulled the plug on his soul. What happens now? He asked, barely above a whisper. Hayworth stepped back. Now? Now you pray the Department of Defense sends a lawyer before they send a firing squad. And then he turned, leaving Brent alone in a room that no longer recognized his authority. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, like the final breath before a missile strike. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, the machinery of military protocol was already spinning. The men in suits were watching. The files were being pulled, and the weight of one unspoken name had already begun to crush the precinct from the inside out. The weight of her name had just begun its descent when the aftershocks hit. It started not with sirens, but with silence, the kind that precedes institutional recalibration, cold, calculated, and absolute. Within the first hour of the Red 5 alert, the Pentagon issued a Level 1 rapid response communique to all relevant branches, flagged for immediate eyes-on review. The subject line carried no ambiguity. Assault on General Angela V. Maddox authorization, critical generality. Inside the sealed message were 4 attachments. One was the incident clip, another was her personnel file, the third a list of medals spanning 2 decades, the fourth a statement typed in black capital letters. No names, no salutation, no ceremony. It read, "No individual, disuniformed or otherwise, is permitted to discredit, disrespect, or physically compromise a serving U.S. general officer. Violence will be considered a threat to national command." Structure, it was not outrage. It was an order. It was the voice of the system clearing its throat before delivering a consequence. Angela V. Maddox. The file labeled her record as classified but exceptional. 3 operational command ribbons, 2 Joint Distinguished Service Medals, head of Tactical Command Unit 40, which executed classified extractions in conflict zones where diplomacy had failed and human lives hung on edge. She had stood on soil no reporter ever touched and brought men home who never had names printed in ink. Her discipline was doctrine. Her silence wasn't passivity. It was lethal restraint. Her name was not just on records. It was engraved into defense strategy. By the second hour, the Joint Chiefs had convened an emergency council, not for a press conference, for contingency planning. The issue wasn't just optics, it was internal balance. A uniformed officer had struck a general on American soil, on camera, without provocation. There were no variables left to interpret. It was the truth, crystallized and undeniable. The question wasn't what happened, it was how to preserve the hierarchy. The memo hit the precinct by noon. Brent Keller was summoned not to speak but to listen. The room was dry and overlit. No lawyers, no handcuffs. Just 6 faces that didn't blink, and a folder placed neatly in front of him. On the cover, DOD Directive Protest Assessment. No one said his name. An officer in dress blues read from the document. It was precise, surgical in tone. Lieutenant Brent Keller, per Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and under Interagency Conduct Regulations, you are hereby suspended from duty effective immediately pending investigation. You are not to enter law enforcement premises, communicate with department personnel, or access case files in any form. This is a non-disciplinary removal to protect the integrity of the command structure. Brent opened his mouth. "Do not respond," the officer said, without raising his voice. "This is not a hearing, this is a notice." The paper was signed, dated, already archived. He stared at the page, but the words didn't change. They burned without flame. He felt it not in his chest, but in the way no one looked at him. There had always been silence in rooms, but never like this. This was the silence of severance, of the system stepping back like a wall, removing its brick. When the meeting adjourned, no one said goodbye. As Brent walked through the precinct halls, every eye shifted, but none met his. He was a void now, visible but avoided, a warning, not a colleague. He passed 2 junior officers. One coughed, the other turned her back before he got within arm's reach. Outside the conference room, a monitor displayed a breaking news banner. Pentagon responds to General's assault. No exception for uniform. It wasn't about rage anymore. It wasn't even about shame. It was about the immovable weight of a system that, once awakened, did not scream, it erased. And Brent Keller, once clothed in command, now wore only the chill of his irrelevance. The corridor still echoed with avoidance when Brent stepped into the locker room and slammed the door behind him. Silence followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He dropped his badge, still clipped, still mocking, onto the cold metal bench, and it clattered with the dry finality of a closing file. He sat, not with the weight of exhaustion, but with the dread of recognition. The name Maddox hadn't stopped repeating in his head since the call. Not the rank, the name. Angela V. Maddox. It kept circling, carving into his nerves, unspooling something buried so deep he thought it was dead. But memories don't die, they wait. And in that moment, the wall started bleeding them back. The hum of fluorescent lights above flickered, and with it, so did the present. One breath ago he was here. The next he was back in the sand-colored barracks of Fort Ravenhall. Year 16 of a system that pretended to cleanse, but only displaced rage. He was younger, sharper, angrier. His fists had done the talking then. One grip around a fellow recruit's throat during a routine drill, pressure building until the boy's face had blanched, lips trembling, his voice strangled into gurgles. There hadn't been a provocation, just a look, a hesitation in line. Brent had seen weakness and decided to stamp it out. No one had stopped him. Not until Maddox stepped in. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't yanked him away. She had simply appeared in the frame of the doorway like a line in the sand, her expression hard enough to shatter bone. He remembered the stillness in her, like a force wrapped in control, and how her eyes had met his without flinching. Put him down, she had said, not shouted, not begged, mocking, and he had. Because there was something about her voice that didn't ask for obedience. It assumed it, as if the very laws of action deferred to her presence. His fingers had loosened and the recruit had dropped to the dirt, coughing, gasping like a man resurrected. The next morning, a letter had arrived at his bunk. One sentence, unfit to carry a weapon. Signed, General A.V. Maddox. He had never forgiven her for that. Never forgot the humiliation of being stripped not by the tribunal, but by a single sentence. No explanation, no second chance, just judgment, swift and surgical. She hadn't even stayed to see his reaction. She had moved on, as if ending him was routine. And now she was back, standing in front of him, silent, bleeding, whole. He stood and staggered toward the mirror. The reflection hit him like a punch. Same jawline, same rage beneath the skin. But his eyes, they were wide, not with fury, with recognition, with fear. The mirror blurred, not from dust, from blood, his own. Somewhere along the way, during the conference room, or maybe when he stepped out into the hallway, he had bitten down on the inside of his cheek. Now it bled, a line of red sliding over his lower lip. He stared at it, transfixed, a mirror version of what he had seen on her that morning. His blood, like hers. But hers had said something. He'd just stained the floor. He reached back and, in a fit of something primal, something too loud to contain, he slammed his fist into the glass. It cracked, first once, then a spider web of fractures exploded outward, distorting his face into jagged pieces. He didn't move, he just stared at the fragments. His breath quickened. "Why her?" he muttered. His voice was lower than before, almost a growl. "Why today?" There was no answer, just the mirror breaking him into someone he didn't want to recognize. He had thought she was just another woman in uniform, another cog to intimidate, another body to shove down to lift himself. But now it was clear she had been sent back not as punishment, but as prophecy, and she didn't need to say a word to bring his past clawing back to life. The mirror still whispered cracks when the past came roaring through the present. It didn't knock, it didn't crawl, it detonated. An old file unsealed and exposed, sweeping through digital feeds like a subpoena from history. At 9:42 AME, the PDF titled B. Keller _dismissal _classified IAADH'd surfaced on a veterans forum and hit the open net within minutes. The source was anonymous, but the contents were unmistakably real. Line by line, fact by fact, it told the story Brent Keller had spent years erasing. The file was cold, brutal, government-issued in format but surgical in effect. It detailed the incident at Fort Ravenhall in flat military prose. Subject: Private First Class Brent Keller. Incident: unprovoked physical assault on fellow trainee during controlled drill. Action: the aggressor applied a sustained chokehold. Intervention required. Commanding Officer, General Angela V. Maddox. The next page was worse. A still frame from a training camera. Brent's face caught mid-strike, knuckles buried in another recruit's gut. The victim doubled over, gasping, eyes wide with confusion and pain. No provocation, no warning, just raw, unleashed violence. The caption below it was simple: unjustified use of force during peacetime protocol. And then came the last page, the kill shot. A one-lil dismissal, handwritten by Maddox herself. Ink slanted but steady, as if she had penned it without hesitation. Unfit to carry a weapon. No appeal, no ceremony, just a sentence and a signature. Within the hour, the document had been reposted over 1 million times. On Twitter, the hashtag #UnFitToCarry trended beside "Who is she?" But the public wasn't confused. They were galvanized. The narrative had evolved. This wasn't a man snapping under pressure. This was a man who had always been a threat, repackaged and rebadged in uniform. The system hadn't created him. It had ignored the warning label. Clips from his training days followed fast. Low-res footage from military archives, grainy but damning. In one, he was screaming in a recruit's face, spit flying. In another, shoving a locker door shut as someone tried to crawl out. Then came the worst, a video, just 6 seconds long, showing him swing his fist into a teammate's jaw without reason, without build-up, just blind rage rendered in real time. The camera angle was poor, but the intent was clear. And behind every clip, every still, every paragraph of text, one name pulsed like a drumbeat: Maddox. She had seen it. She had written it. She had tried to stop him before the badge ever touched his chest. And the people, bruised from watching power go unchecked for too long, responded like a dam had broken. Posts exploded. She warned us. This isn't new behavior. This is archived aggression. She tried to keep him from wearing a gun. We gave him one. Maddox saved us from him once. Who listened? The mood had shifted from outrage to a cold, collective resolve. Brent Keller wasn't a rogue cop. He was a failed soldier, given a second life in the wrong uniform. And now, with his file splayed open like a dissection, that second life was dead. Inside the precinct, no one spoke to him. The air had changed again. It was no longer heavy with judgment, it was hollow with confirmation. The secret had been exposed. The system had been warned, and Maddox's voice, quiet, curt, official, had become prophecy. On national television, the last page of the file was displayed. The anchor read it aloud, slowly. Unfit to carry a weapon. She paused, then added, written by General Angela V. Maddox, 12 years ago. Maybe we should have listened. By 1:17 p.m., a congressional staffer reposted the file with one line: "If we let him hold a badge, we ignored our verdict." and somewhere, in a hall of Pentagon records, her handwriting still sat in permanent ink, a warning etched into the bones of a system too proud to check itself. But the system remembered now, and the voice they once filed away had returned to haunt them in the most unforgiving way, not through vengeance, but through proof. As Maddox had once written, and now the world could see it in black and white, if we let him carry a weapon, the system will end up shooting itself, and it just had. And so it was written, on paper and across a million screens, that the man had failed long before the strike, but it was not he the world awaited, it was her. She who had not spoken, she who had stood still while the nation roared, she whose blood had become more than a wound, it had become a mirror. And now the cameras turned, not to questions, not to apologies, to present. The courtyard was stone gray, sun-washed and silent, cleared of noise by something weightier than instruction. Rows of reporters stood behind barricades, not for safety but reverence. Their microphones pointed not to mouths, but to stillness. No one called her name, no one shouted a question, no one dared. Because, as she stepped into view, time itself seemed to slow. Angela V. Maddox walked forward with the precision of a ticking clock. Every step was measured, grounded, not rehearsed, but ritual. Her uniform, creased with perfection, marked by the chaos of that morning, still bore the smear of blood across her right cheek. It wasn't cleaned, it wasn't softened. It stayed where it had dried, like a badge pinned by sacrifice itself. The collar was stained, the cuff is stiff with red, and she wore it without shame. No speech, no handlers, no security detail flanking her in some charade of power. Just a woman, a soldier, walking straight into the center of a nation's conscience. The sun struck the brass buttons of her coat, reflecting briefly in glints like silent bursts of fire. Her boots landed with soft finality against the flagstone. The background blurred, buildings, people, wires, until there was only her. Maddox was no longer a person. She was composed, a living canvas of dignity and defiance, wrapped in fabric the color of storm and blood. At the center of the space, a boy stood, no older than 9, small, holding a bouquet of wildflowers clumsily wrapped in white paper. His hands shook. He did not speak. He only looked up. Maddox slowed, stopped, looked down, not as a soldier, not as an official, but as a presence acknowledging another. Her fingers rose, adjusted the brass epaulette on her left shoulder, an exact, silent gesture. Then she lowered herself by a fraction, just enough. She bowed her head. The boy lifted the bouquet, she took it, and the cameras clicked, not in frenzy but reverence. The lenses, for once, could not distort. They could only record. A single drop of crimson, dry now, trailed from her temple to her collar. The flowers shook in her hand, and still she said nothing. She turned, she walked. Each step away carried the weight of restraint, of fury buried beneath discipline, of victory declared not by sound but by stillness. The crowd parted like water. No applause, no shouts, just breathing, just recognition. Behind her, 100 red lights blinked, cameras rolling, journalists stunned, but none breaking the spell. There would be headlines, yes. There would be commentary, endless panels, and op-eds trying to bottle the moment, but none of it would touch what had happened in that courtyard, because what the nation saw was not a press conference. It was a reckoning, rendered without a single word, and in that blood-stained silence, the world heard her louder than it had ever heard any speak. She had walked away without a word, but the echo of her silence grew louder than any oration that followed. It reverberated through media outlets, across living rooms, into think tanks and classrooms, until it reached the marble chambers of Capitol Hill, where silence is rarely welcome and rarely understood. But now, it demanded a seat. The chamber was colder than usual, not in temperature but in tone. Ornate brass fixtures gleamed overhead, casting long shadows over mahogany desks and sealed folders. At the head of the hearing room, the seal of the United States gleamed above a half circle of lawmakers in dark suits. Before them, microphones waited. Cameras were present but restrained. This wasn't a theater. This was scrutiny. The committee was convened not to sensationalize, but to reckon, and no one present needed reminding why they were there. On the agenda, unlawful assault of Major General Angela V. Maddox by uniformed police officer, National Oversight and Accountability Inquiry. A congressman from Pennsylvania leaned into his mic. His voice was deliberate, firm, not raised. If a two-star general of the United States Army can be assaulted in public, on camera, in full uniform, with no one stepping in, not even the system she's sworn to protect, then I ask this body, what citizen has faith in law enforcement now? No one answered. Not yet, because one name still floated in the air, like smoke clinging to everything it touched. Brent Keller sat under oath, isolated, pale, not in uniform, not in control. He didn't speak, not yet summoned. His seat, though central, was eclipsed by something that wasn't even present. Her absence. Angela Maddox had declined to appear. She didn't need the room. The room already belonged to her. Instead, a sealed package had arrived that morning, addressed to the committee chair. It was small, unadorned. Inside, a single drive. No note, no label. Just one line on the attached form. I am not seeking retribution. I am seeking clarity for those who must live with the consequences of silence. The audio was cued, played. Her voice came through without introduction, low and calm, without distortion or emotion. What happened to me is not exceptional. It is only visible. You have asked what should be done. I will not advise punishment. That is not my duty. I ask for one thing, an explanation. Not for me, for the civilians who saw a general fall and wondered if anyone would rise in her place. If justice has weight, let it bear down, not as revenge, but as balance. Then the recording ended. No music, no dramatics. Just static silence. The chamber didn't stir for a full 10 seconds. Even the coughs were swallowed. Because it wasn't testimony. It was an indictment wrapped in restraint. She hadn't attacked the institution. She had exposed its consequences. Her voice hadn't carried pain. It carried precision. Brent didn't look up. He didn't flinch when the congressman continued, addressing the room. Nodham, if silence from a victim becomes the most moral voice in the room, then I ask again, who will speak for those without a title? No one had an answer, because Maddox already had, and she had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. And still the silence rang louder than any argument Brent could have made. But silence does not remain empty. It invites revelation, and what filled the void next wasn't defense, wasn't redemption, it was exposure. Cold, unforgiving, precise. The clip aired at 8:06 a.m. across major networks, leaked by a source inside a local investigative unit who had been digging for patterns, not gossip. They found a tape dated 7 years prior, time-stamped and verified, buried in an archived complaint that had quietly vanished from public record. The footage opened on a narrow alleyway behind a row of shuttered businesses. 2 officers stood at the edge of the frame, one of them recognizable despite time. Brent Keller, uniformed, squared shoulders, teeth bared in something that looked too much like pleasure. A civilian lay against the brick wall, arms up, not resisting. Brent stepped forward, fists already clenched. Then she appeared, General Angela V. Maddox, off-duty, no fanfare, no backup. She intercepted his movement in 3 steps, her hand intercepting his wrist, her voice unheard but commanding. The frame stuttered, then stabilized as Brent's body stiffened and backed off. The civilian lived. No charges filed, no headlines ran, but she had stopped him, and now the world saw it. Before that footage even finished airing, a second piece surfaced, a voice memo, recorded on a cell phone, dated months after Brent's dismissal from the military. In it, his voice rang clearly, sharp and bitter. You know what I'd love to do one day? Wear that uniform again, this time as a cop. See how those military types like Maddox look when the badge is on my chest instead of hers. See how they feel when they're not the ones in command. The statement was clear, the intent was venom. The past had not only returned, it had walked hand in hand with the present. Brent watched the clips in a closed conference room. The lights above hummed without pity. The air was stale, cold, with procedural finality. As the footage looped, his face fell from scowl to panic, pride to silence. It was the first time since this all began that his eyes didn't dart in defiance, didn't scan the room to measure power. They stared forward, empty, caught. His mask, so long fused to his face, began to split. Somewhere, far from the walls of hearings and screens, Angela Maddox picked up a pen and wrote into the spine of her weathered field journal. Her handwriting, neat and angled, bore no urgency, just the truth. She had written in ink the same way she once issued orders, in straight lines. I saw him once, with no way forward. This is the second time. That was all. No anger, no gloating, just an observation. Because she had always known what power meant. It wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about weapons. It was about seeing clearly when others lied to themselves. 7 years ago, she had stopped him from striking an innocent. Today, she had stopped him from poisoning a nation's faith in justice, not with force, with memory. The truth didn't hit him all at once. It arrived slowly, cruelly, in each breath, as he realized the world no longer saw him as a man in uniform, but as a man hiding behind one. The mask was gone, and beneath it, there was nothing left to protect. Under the hard fluorescence of the precinct locker room, where every echo seemed to hiss with judgment, Brent Keller stood motionless. The air was cold, not from the temperature, but from the way silence had congealed into something solid, something thick enough to choke on. His name, once barked out in briefings, once whispered with a mixture of envy and fear, had now become a ghost. No one spoke it aloud. They just watched him unravel, watched the last fibers of his uniform identity get tugged, thread by thread, into irrelevance. A duffel bag lay open on the bench, its zipper stretched wide like a wound. The order had come hours earlier, delivered with clinical precision by the Internal Review Board. Signed, sealed, and silently understood. Surrender all issued equipment, weapon, badge, and uniform. There would be no protest, no appeals. Brent, for once, said nothing, his face a mask too worn to hold its sneer, cracked in places only he could feel. Still, his posture was defiant. Still, his hands trembled as they moved toward the badge. He undid the buttons of his shirt slowly, like peeling away armor fused to skin. Every snap felt louder than the last, each one a tiny bullet of humiliation. Beneath the fabric, years of violence, loyalty twisted by ego, and a bitter obsession for control festered like rot. Then came the moment, the badge. It gleamed under the lights for the final time, a small, dull emblem of authority now trembling between his fingers. It was on the right side of his chest, not over the heart, no, not anymore. There, directly beneath the metal, was a faint scar, an old, puckered reminder of the night he caught a bullet during a botched drug bust in a warehouse on 6th. The wound had never quite healed clean, not medically, physically, yes, but morally, psychologically, that gash had carved something far deeper into him than flesh. Her? It had planted the seed of his bitterness, and he had watered it every day with entitlement, fury, and the kind of wounded pride that metastasizes into cruel. He hesitated, just for a breath, just long enough to register the moment. Then he reached up, unclasped the badge with a practiced flick, and tore it free. His fingers clenched around it, whitened with pressure, before he dropped it into the bag like trash. It clinked against the handcuffs and the holster, his whole world in a pile of sanctioned steel and stitched identity. Behind him, the chief stood with arms crossed. His voice, when it came, was quiet and cold, like the first wind over a fresh grave. The wound healed, Keller, but your head never did. No pity, no judgment, just the kind of statement that closes a chapter. Keller didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't stoic. It was hollow. This wasn't remorse. This wasn't redemption. This was exposure. A man peeled back to raw intention. All the years he'd worn that uniform like a throne, like a weapon, were collapsing inward. He had thought the badge made him untouchable. but now it was clear it had only ever made him a mirror, reflecting his corruption, brighter and more grotesque with every abuse of power. As he slipped off the shirt completely, the scar on his chest seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. It was small, almost forgettable, but now it screamed. It told a story no one had asked for and no one would believe. The scar was a reminder, not of sacrifice but of fragility, of the exact moment the man became a myth in his head. He had believed that surviving made him superior. He had mistaken pain for permission. The locker room felt colder now. He could feel eyes on his back, though no one spoke. A man stripped of uniform is not just undressed, he is disarmed. Brent was no longer a cop. He wasn't even a threat. He was history, laid bare and rusting. His fingers twitched as if trying to grasp the fabric he'd just removed, to hold on to something, anything, that hadn't already slipped through. No one offered a word, no goodbyes, no contempt, just distance. It was worse than anger. It was an absence. Where he had once filled rooms with dominance, now he left silence in his wake. He zipped up the duffel bag slowly, the sound slicing through the room like a whisper of finality. He threw it over his shoulder, the weight suddenly unfamiliar, lighter than he expected, and yet impossibly heavy. Brent paused at the threshold of the locker room, hand hovering near the doorframe. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he knew. Knew if he turned around, he might see in their eyes what he feared most, that he had never been feared, only tolerated, never respected, only obeyed, not because of who he was, but because of what he wore. He stepped into the hallway, shirtless, scar gleaming like a brand, not heroic, not tragic, just exposed. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The system had already spit him out, and Brant Keller, for all his fury and theatrics, had finally come face to face with the truth. No uniform could shield a man from the rot growing inside him. The hallways smelled like polished stone and forgotten pride. Brant Keller moved through them like a ghost who still believed he had weight. He kept his head down, not from shame, he didn't believe in shame, but from the strange, hollow instinct that told him this wasn't his building anymore. The precinct had once echoed with the rhythm of his boots, with the bark of his orders, with the bark of his orders, with the bark of his orders, with the bark of his orders. Now his steps barely stirred the silence. He had come back not for confrontation, not even for closure. He just needed to see. He waited until dusk, when the lobby lights softened and the offices thinned out. No badge hung at his waist. No nameplate marked his arrival. He passed unnoticed through the glass doors, the security guard too new or too indifferent to stop him. Brent had learned how to walk like he still belonged, even when the world had started whispering otherwise. That was the last trick he had left. The wall of service stood in the east wing, lined with spotlights and arrogance, a shrine of stainless steel and matte black plaques. It was where careers were frozen mid-victory, captured in photographs meant to outlive their subjects. He approached it slowly, each step slower than the last, as if his boots were sinking into the floor. He already knew what he wasn't going to find. Still, hope is a stubborn thing, even in the bones of a man like Brent. The space where his photograph used to hang, third row center, was empty. No plaque, no frame, no legacy. Instead, a newer frame had taken its place, slightly larger, brighter. The lighting had been adjusted to highlight it from above like a portrait in a museum. The photograph was striking, not just in composition but in silence. Angela Maddox stood in full dress uniform, blood-stained collar still visible under the meticulously aligned medals. The background was blurred, deliberately neutral, forcing the eye to her face. She wasn't smiling. She didn't need to. Below the image, in crisp serif font, a title read, Defender of Civic Honor, General Angela V. Maddox. The citation was signed by the governor's hand, dated only 2 days ago. The seal glinted like a verdict. Mayor Byron Ethelrether. Brent didn't breathe. His chest tightened, not with rage, but with something more corrosive. Recognition, not her, of himself, of what he had thought power looked like. He remembered the weight of his badge, the way it sat cold and righteous on his chest. He remembered the feeling of being obeyed, of rooms that adjusted themselves around his presence, but standing here, under the sharp, unforgiving lights, He saw the difference. Her authority didn't ask for attention. It absorbed it. It didn't bark. It didn't bruise. It stood, his jaw tensed, the muscle ticking under his cheek like a fault line. He stepped closer, close enough to see the texture of the photograph's print. The blood stain on her collar wasn't an accident. It had been left untouched, immortalized, a deliberate scar, unhidden, unashamed. It was not a weakness, it was a flag. A voice, young and sharp, cut through his thoughts. "She's the real deal," the boy said. Brent turned his head slightly. A cadet, maybe 20, maybe less, stood beside him. Fresh uniform, eyes wide with respect, not fear. The kind of kid who hadn't lived through the old system, who didn't know what it meant to be afraid of the wrong man in the right uniform. "She's what a warrior looks like," the cadet continued, pointing up at the frame. "They said she didn't say a word when it happened, just stood there, took it, made the whole country listen." Brent said nothing. The boy didn't even look at him, didn't recognize him, didn't care who he was. That, more than anything, landed hard. He had been erased, not with violence, but with replacement. The cadet walked away, boot heels clicking in brisk rhythm, leaving Brent alone in the glow of someone else's triumph. He stared up at Maddox's photo, trying to hate her, but hate requires friction, and all he found now was gravity, slow, inevitable, absolute. She had never screamed, never cursed, never begged. She had let the world turn and watched it turn toward her. Brent stepped back, not out of respect, out of necessity. The wall didn't need him anymore. The building didn't need him. History didn't even remember to flinch. As he turned away, the reflection in the glass caught him. Just a man in civilian clothes, with nothing on his chest but the faint imprint of a scar, barely visible under his shirt. A relic of a moment he once thought proved his strength, but now that scar looked smaller, not heroic, just unnecessary. Outside, the evening air pressed against the glass like a judgment. He didn't linger. He didn't look back again. Some walls don't echo when you leave them. Some legacies collapse without sound, and some truths are seen, not told. He had seen enough. He had seen enough, but clarity doesn't always bring closure. Brent Keller sat alone in a rented apartment that smelled faintly of dust and yesterday's sweat, its cheap blinds casting warped shadows on the wall like prison bars. The silence was not peaceful. It was swollen, pressing against his skull with questions he never used to ask. The photograph on that wall, the young cadet's words, the scar under his shirt, all of it spiraled into a thought he could no longer outrun. What if I was never what I believed myself to be? That night, under the dim light of a crooked lamp, Brent did something he had never done before. He wrote a letter, not a report, not a complaint, not an incident summary dripping with passive aggression, but a letter with his hand. On paper, no lawyer, no chain of command, just ink, pressure, and desperation. It wasn't long. It didn't beg, but it bent in ways his voice never had. "I need to hear you say something, anything, one sentence. That's all. One sentence from you to me." He didn't sign it with rank or title. He didn't have one anymore, just Brent Keller. That name, stripped of shields and authority, looked smaller than he expected in the bottom right corner of the page. He hand-delivered it the next morning, slipping the envelope into the front office of the Defense Council where Maddox's assistant was said to work. He didn't ask to wait. He didn't ask for an answer. He simply left. That was the plan. Leave it there, let her decide. But for all his posturing, Brent waited, at home, beside the window, eyes flicking to the door with every creak of the hallway. The weight of anticipation sat like a loaded gun on the table in front of him. His hands moved constantly, pacing, twitching, checking his phone despite knowing no one would call. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself she would ignore it. He told himself that it was better, safer. Then the envelope came. It was unmarked, slipped under the door with bureaucratic efficiency. No return address, just his name, typewritten with clinical detachment. He stared at it for a long time, thumb pressed against the seam, heartbeat shallow. His mouth was dry. His spine is too straight. He opened it like one opens a verdict. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was not hers. It was neat, professional, and dispassionate. A secretary's touch. Her message had been dictated, but the words, they were a scalpel. Mrs. Maddox declines your request. She does not speak to those who have willfully ignored the humanity of others. She acts only with those who still carry hope to restore their own. There was no signature, no postscript, not even a formal salutation, just those two sentences. The first slammed the door. The second locked it from the inside. It was not righteous. It was not vindictive. It was simply true. Brent read it again, then again, slowly. The words didn't change, but something inside him did. Not redemption, not regret, just recognition of a chasm that had always been there, but that he had once believed could be crossed with a badge and a bark. His lips curled, not into a smile, but into something uglier, an almost snarl, a twitch of disbelief that someone like her could still speak from such altitude, from that place of precision and calm, as though nothing he had done could ever touch her. And maybe it hadn't. Maybe that was what stung most. Because Brent Keller, for all his rage, had always depended on noise, on escalation, on dominance by volume and posture, but Maddox had done the opposite. She had silenced a nation without raising her voice. She had stood in uniform, covered in her blood, and made the world speak for her. And now, she denied him not through confrontation, but through absence. That kind of power couldn't be shouted down and couldn't be touched. He crumpled the letter slowly, not in rage, not this time, just because he couldn't stand to hold it. It burned. More than anything, anyone had ever screamed at him. No courtroom dressing down, no superior's reprimand, just this sterile sheet of rejection, so calm it felt cruel. He didn't sleep that night. Sleep requires peace or exhaustion. He had neither. The room felt smaller with every passing hour, and even the shadows seemed to keep their distance. Not out of fear, out of contempt, because somewhere in the quiet core of his chest, Brent Keller had begun to understand the cost of ignoring humanity. Not just hers, not just the people he had bruised with his authority, but his own. He had carved himself into a shape that couldn't feel softness, couldn't feel empathy. And now, when all he wanted was a sentence, a single goddamn word, she gave him silence, the kind that roared. He thought about responding, about writing back, about trying to twist her words into something he could fight against. But there was nothing to fight. Her message had been a final line, drawn without fury, without flourish, just firm enough to tell him the truth. You are not the kind of man I believe can change. Not a scream, not a sermon, just a closed door, and behind it a woman who no longer needed to justify herself to men like him. Brent Keller folded the letter flat again, smoothed out the creases, placed it gently on the table beside his untouched cup of coffee. He didn't tear it, didn't burn it, he just left it there, let it sit, let it speak. The letter lay untouched where he had left it, but its weight lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. Brent Keller moved through the world with the quiet of a man who had finally run out of noise. No uniform, no badge, no agenda, just a presence, diluted, unmoored, like someone walking inside his echo. The symposium was hosted in a gleaming government building in the center of the city, its walls thick with language, posters, slogans, banners stitched with words like reform, rebuild, reimagine. He hadn't come to speak. He hadn't been invited. But Brent was still the kind of man who believed proximity was power. If he showed up, clean-cut, expression neutral, presence unannounced, maybe someone would ask the question he didn't have the nerve to voice himself. The hallway was long and narrow, paneled with glass that reflected light too bright to feel natural. A sterile corridor between two conference rooms, filled with the muted hum of distant voices and fluorescent buzz. And yet, in that instant, it narrowed even further. Time folded, sound dropped, because she was there. Angela Maddox. She stepped into the hallway from the far side without ceremony, her pace measured, her uniform as precise as her stride. No entourage, no theatrics, just her and that unbearable, effortless gravity she carried like a second skin. Brant's heart flinched before his body did. He hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't believed she would even attend. And yet here she was, her path slicing toward his like a blade through smoke. He straightened instinctively, as if his spine might conjure back the rank he'd lost. His mouth opened before he could stop it, breath catching like a lie halfway out. His voice, that old tool of command, of manipulation, of self-preservation, refused to obey. All he managed was her name. Maddox. She didn't stop. She didn't blink. Her gaze skimmed past him, not in dismissal, but with something far more precise. Detachment. She had already measured him and found nothing worth holding. And then, as she passed within arm's reach, close enough that he caught the scent of starch and resolve, she spoke, not loud, not sharp, just enough to strike without shattering. You could start by apologizing to yourself. No pause, no turn, just that. And then she kept walking, heels clicking with the rhythm of a woman who'd said everything she needed to say and hadn't wasted a syllable more. The hallway swallowed her steps like a stage curtain drawn shut. Brent stood frozen, air caught in his lungs like glass. The words weren't cruel. They didn't sting in the way he knew how to fight. No insult, no blame, no grand condemnation, just a mirror, quiet, unyielding, held up to the part of him he had spent years building walls against. He could have handled rage, he could have handled public shame, a shouting match, a courtroom clash, fists and fury and fire. But this gentle incision cut deeper, because it left him alone in the wound. His hand grazed the wall beside him, not for balance, but for proof that something in this moment was still real, still solid. Her voice echoed, not in the air, but in the hollows of his mind, circling the places he couldn't seal shut anymore. You could start by apologizing to yourself. The words didn't grant him grace. They handed him responsibility. No one else to blame. No system, no upbringing, no enemies to point at or partners to drag down with him. Just the man in the hallway, the man who had to live with what he had been. He turned slightly, just enough to watch her silhouette vanish into the next room. Her posture is unbroken. Her pace is unwavering. A storm that had passed through without thunder but left the structure redefined. For a long time, Brent didn't move. The hallway stretched around him like a vacuum. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no crowd to perform for, just his reflection in the glass, the sag of his shoulders, the pale strip where a badge used to gleam, the way his mouth remained open as if still searching for a defense that wouldn't come. He closed it, not in acceptance, not in peace, but because there was nothing left to say. She hadn't slammed a door, she had left it ajar, but made it clear he wasn't ready to walk through. Not until he faced something she could never give him. Not forgiveness, not answers, but a reckoning, personal, private, punishing, the kind that begins in silence. The echo of her words, quiet, exact, surgical, still threaded through his chest like wire pulled too tight. You could start by apologizing to yourself. Brent Keller had carried that line with him like a splinter buried under the skin, not bleeding but refusing to heal. It wasn't just a rebuke, it was exile, not from a system, not from a rank, but from the illusion that had once made him feel untouchable. And yet here he was, drawn back like a moth not to fire but to the ashes of his own making. The precinct felt different, even from the outside. The glass on the front doors had been replaced, no longer tinted in the old way that distorted reflections, but clean, clear, and unflinching. He walked past them without registering the change, his gait unhurried but off-tempo, like a song half forgotten. No one stopped him, no one called his name. He wasn't there to disrupt, only to witness. His authority had long been severed. All that remained was a tether of memory, dragging him inward. The hallway to the training division had once felt like a spine, rigid, commanding, lined with fluorescent light and the low murmur of preparation. Now it breathed differently. There was movement, but it wasn't laced with the sharp edges of tension or fear. Cadets moved with intent, not caution. The absence of threat was palpable. It irritated Brent in a way he didn't want to admit. He told himself discipline had softened, but somewhere deeper he knew it had only matured. He reached room 4B without thinking. His feet remembered what his pride tried to forget. This room had once been his kingdom, the space where his voice had bent others into shape, where cadets flinched under his stare and straightened their backs beneath his bark, where the mirror, his mirror, had loomed above the podium like a godless eye, catching every imperfection, every lapse in stance, every trace of fear. He had made them look at themselves until they cracked or conformed. That was the method, that was the point. He placed his hand on the doorknob and paused. There was no ceremony here, no flash of memory, no swell of music in his head, just a simple turn of the wrist and the quiet click of a life he no longer belonged to. The door swung open, and Brent stepped into a room that had survived him. The air inside was cool, not with indifference, but with clarity. No chalk dust, no sweat was baked into the walls. The podium stood in the same place. The floor mats were still aligned in perfect rows. The training dummy in the corner was freshly padded, but something immediate and sharp gripped his attention. The wall behind the podium, the wall that had once borne his judgment, was no longer watching. The mirror was gone. That massive rectangular slab of truth and threat, which had reflected every hesitation, every weakness, every crack in the facade of those who entered, had been removed. Brent's breath caught, though he didn't know why. It wasn't grief. It wasn't shocking. It was something stranger, displacement, as if someone had peeled his name off the room and replaced it with air. He stepped forward slowly, gaze locked on the space where the mirror had hung. He remembered how the light used to bounce off it, how his reflection had hovered over every session like an overseer, silent but omnipotent. That mirror had been his weapon as much as his badge had. It forced cadets to confront what he told them they were. He'd stand under it like a priest beneath stained glass, delivering sermons on discipline, duty, and unrelenting control. Now, the space was filled, but not by a reflection, by something heavier, a plaque. It was sleek, deliberate, and understated. No glare, no shine, just matte black wood with golden text that didn't scream. It simply stood there, quiet and resolute. Brent's eyes traced the words, slowly, like reading a verdict carved in stone. No one learns anything until they are willing to look at themselves. And beneath that, in clean, unassuming script, Angela V. Maddox. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. The message didn't accuse, it didn't mock, it didn't even refer to him, and yet it struck with more finality than any courtroom ruling or disciplinary file ever had. This wasn't a correction, it was a transformation. A room once ruled by intimidation is now led by reflection, not on the surface, but from within. Brent stepped closer. His boots made no sound on the newly waxed floor. He stared at the plaque, then at the faint outline on the wall where the mirror had once hung. The paint behind it was a shade lighter, untouched by years of light and dust. The ghost of its frame still lingered in contrast, a pale rectangular memory that would slowly fade but never fully vanish. The symmetry was brutal. He realized then what had been done, not in anger, not in protest, but in strategy. This wasn't just the removal of glass, it was the removal of power, his era, his philosophy. What had once made cadets fear the weight of their image had now been turned against him, without ever mentioning his name. Brent Keller was no longer reflected here, and that, more than any punishment, was the sentence. He stood in front of the plaque longer than he intended, arms crossed, not out of comfort, but to keep something from falling apart inside him. Dignity, delusion, he wasn't sure. The air in the room had changed, or maybe it was just the way it moved around him now, indifferent to his presence. For years this space had amplified his voice like a cathedral for command. Now it absorbed him like silence, swallowing a name that no longer mattered. He was still comfortable with that. No longer mattered. There had been a time when cadets stood here, trembling beneath his words. He had made a career out of molding men and women with pressure and scrutiny, rewarding stiffness, punishing uncertainty. He'd walk the line with his hands behind his back, eyes scanning for flaws, ears trained for hesitation. His authority was the kind that creaked floorboards and made stomachs tighten. He was the lesson, and the mirror was his enforcer. But the plaque on the wall didn't enforce anything. It didn't glare, it didn't reflect, it invited. That was the insult. Subtle, but surgical. Maddox hadn't rewritten his methods. She had simply made them obsolete. The quote wasn't clever. It wasn't even new. But in this room, on that wall, it said something devastating without needing volume. You're not in this conversation anymore. Her signature at the bottom wasn't boastful. It didn't scream, "Look at me." It whispered, "I've already spoken. You're just now listening." He turned away, if only to avoid the temptation of tearing it down. But his reflection wasn't there to challenge him anymore. There was nothing to confront, only a wall that had learned to teach without intimidation. His eyes scanned the rest of the room, searching for familiarity. The mats were newer, the gear is better organized, a chart of breathing techniques hung near the back wall, something he never would have tolerated. He had once called mindfulness a luxury for the undisciplined. He could almost hear himself say it, voice dripping with that signature sneer, the kind that ended conversations and shut down any impulse toward vulnerability. And yet now the room held space for all of it. Control and clarity, authority and humanity. The realization settled like dust in the lungs. This room had evolved past him. He moved toward the podium, fingertips grazing the edge out of habit. The wood was new, lighter in tone, no more dense, no sharp corners where frustration had landed. He'd once slammed a folder against that podium so hard the microphone cracked. He remembered the sound it made, like bones snapping. He had wanted it to scare them, to remind them that hesitation was weakness, and that weakness got people killed. But this space no longer celebrated control by fear, now it modeled control by understanding. Maddox hadn't needed to destroy his legacy. She had simply replaced it with presence, with clarity, with a single sentence that asked a question instead of delivering a threat. No one learns anything until they are willing to look at themselves. That was the true cruelty of the change. It didn't erase him, it outgrew him. Without violence, without ceremony, without even mentioning his name. And what terrified Brent wasn't that others would forget who he was, it was what they already had. He moved to the back of the room, slow and deliberate, like someone retracing the site of a former crime, not to relive it, but to measure its distance from the present. The windows were cleaner than he remembered, or maybe it was just the light. Softer now, more open. The glare he once welcomed, the harsh glow that punished every flaw, had been replaced with something diffused, intentional. A room that once demanded perfection now encouraged awareness. That shift wasn't cosmetic, it was ideological. Brent turned to face the podium, his old position. He tried to see himself there again. Boots planted wide, voice slicing through the air, cadets silent, eyes fixed. But that image didn't fit anymore. It was like watching an outdated reel, one that had once moved people but now felt out of rhythm, out of place, like it belonged to a different building, a different era, a different man. What struck him most wasn't the loss of authority, it was the absence of reverence. The room used to feel like it was inhaling when he entered. Now, it didn't flinch, it didn't bend, it simply continued. The floor didn't recognize his step, the walls didn't echo his presence. His legacy wasn't erased, it was no longer required. That plaque, so still and quiet on the back wall, said everything he had refused to say for years. He had made people mirror him, she had made them mirror themselves. And beneath that truth, something darker stirred. Had he ever wanted them to learn, or had he simply wanted to be obeyed? He didn't like the answer, because the mirror had always reflected what he demanded, not what they understood. He'd called it preparation. He'd called it toughness, but it was compliance, nothing more. And now, Maddox, who had bled in silence, stood in silence, dismantled him in silence, had replaced his reflection with one sentence that turned the entire room around. He could almost hear her voice, not loud, not cold, but anchored, repeating the quote, without performance, without pretense. No one learns anything until they are willing to look at themselves. She didn't need a glass to make them see. She had used words, and not many. Brent's fingers twitched by his side. He wasn't used to being this quiet. His instincts begged him to speak, to reclaim the space, to leave a mark deeper than hers. But the room didn't care for marks anymore. It had shifted toward something cleaner, something stripped of fear, something he had never taught. And in that stillness, he felt it not defeat, not shame, but displacement, a kind of vanishing that didn't happen with gunfire or demotions. This was erasure by evolution. The space had grown, he had not. Brent stood motionless for a long time, caught in the strange quiet between memory and irrelevance. The walls no longer reverberated with his voice, and the air did not bend around him the way it once had. He had walked into this room expecting echoes, fragments of his authority clinging to the corners, maybe the ghost of a salute or a nod of fear still lingering in the air. But all of it was gone. Not wiped clean, simply moved on. The room had exhaled him. He approached the plaque once more, this time not as a former instructor, not even as a man trying to hold on to what was lost, but as a visitor, as someone who, for the first time, read the words not with defensiveness, but with recognition. No one learns anything until they are willing to look at themselves. It was a lesson he had never offered, because it was a lesson he had never learned. He had once believed strength was about control over others, over fear, over the narrative, that if you never flinched, never cracked, never apologized, you stayed untouchable. But Maddox had stood with blood on her collar, no words in her mouth, and a nation bowed in her silence. She didn't dominate the room, she changed it. The signature beneath the quote wasn't ornamental. It wasn't self-congratulatory. It was a stake in the ground, quiet, immovable, hers. He wondered, with a bitterness he couldn't quite name, whether anyone had fought to keep the mirror, whether someone had argued, even briefly, that tradition mattered, that the methods had worked, but the room said otherwise. The plaque hadn't been added to the mirror, it had replaced it completely. The reflection was gone. In its place, a challenge. He reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the plaque. The surface was cool, unyielding. He pressed his palm flat against it, expecting something, a rush of anger, a resurgence of identity, but nothing came. Just the quiet confirmation that this space would never again mirror him back. Brent turned and walked out of room 4B without a sound. Not because he wanted to preserve its sanctity, but because he finally understood. He was not part of this story anymore. The lesson, the authority, the reverence, they didn't belong to him. They never had. They had belonged to the institution, and now they belonged to a different voice. One that didn't shout, one that didn't shame, one that stood and waited and let others come forward when they were ready to see themselves. The hallway outside was bright. The glass in the doors no longer distorted his shape. As he passed his reflection, faint and clean in the new panes, he didn't flinch. There was nothing there to argue with. Just a man passing through a place that no longer needed to remember him to prove that it had grown. And in that quiet truth, Brent Keller finally stepped into absence. The door to room 4B had closed behind him, but the silence inside it clung to Brent Keller like the last whisper of a name no one wanted to remember. His footsteps carried him nowhere, just forward, just away, propelled not by destination but by the unbearable presence of what he'd become. Forgotten, but unfinished. Across the city, a different kind of silence was preparing to descend. Not the silence of retreat, nor the awkward hush before confrontation, but the kind that rearranges a nation's pulse. In Washington, D.C., the air around the Capitol was tight with expectation. Every breath measured, every eye trained toward a moment that would be remembered not for what was said, but for what wasn't. It was a national hearing formally titled A Review of Use of Force Policies Across Agencies, but everyone knew better. This wasn't about paperwork. This wasn't about rules. This was about reckoning. The panel of senators sat high above the hearing room, polished wood behind them, microphones curved like serpents toward their mouths, pens clutched tightly in their fingers, not out of necessity but nervous habit. This was no ordinary witness session. The chair in the center, bathed in soft spotlight and framed by two flags, had been reserved for one person, General Angela V. Maddox. She had not spoken publicly since the incident. No interviews, no op-eds, no damage control. While media networks speculated, dissected, and theorized, she remained silent, not absent, present in her stillness. Her silence was not void. It was the strategy. It was weight. And now, the country sat on edge, unsure whether her first public appearance would come with an explosion or an elegy. The chamber was full, not just with reporters and analysts, but with people, real people, survivors, activists, veterans, even cadets from multiple agencies who had requested special seats. Phones were silent, laptops closed. No one wanted to watch this through a screen. They wanted proximity, as if being in the same air as Maddox would bring clarity to something no camera could fully frame. A voice crackled through the overhead speakers. Now entering the chamber, General Angela V. Maddox. There was no applause, no commotion, just a collective inhalation. She walked in with the calm of a storm that had already passed through. Her uniform was perfectly aligned, but not pristine. The same jacket, the same pants, the same quiet stain beneath the left breast pocket that no one had dared bleach out. Her medals remained untouched. Their ribbons faded slightly, not from neglect but from exposure to heat, to sunlight, to blood. She carried no folder, no binder, no stack of carefully prepared remarks, only a slim, black case in her left hand. She held it the way a surgeon holds a scalpel, not to threaten, but to cut with purpose. The senators straightened. Some looked her in the eye. Most didn't. She reached the witness table and placed the black case on its surface without a word. No greeting, no glance, no nod of recognition. She unclasped the lid and, with movements so deliberate they made the room lean forward, withdrew two objects. They didn't shine. They didn't shimmer. They simply existed, grounded and real. The first, a military medal, dented just above its edge, one of the prongs slightly bent, the ribbon dulled with age and wear. The second, a police badge, split clean down the middle, each half curved slightly inward like something that had once resisted breaking until it did. She didn't speak. She didn't raise her head. She didn't offer context. She set them both on the table side by side and took one step back. That single motion was more commanding than a 10-minute speech, and the room, congressmen, civilians, analysts, officers, even those whose careers depended on spoken persuasion, went utterly, devastatingly still. The quiet that followed was not absence. It was pressure. It pressed into the bones of every person in the chamber, seeped under collars and behind temples, wrapped itself around the room with the slow, deliberate weight of something sacred and inescapable. No one dared shuffle, no throat cleared. Even the lights seemed to dim under the command of her stillness. She hadn't raised a finger, hadn't whispered a syllable, but the message was loud enough to be deafening. One by one, eyes dropped to the table. The badge, fractured cleanly, brutally, caught the overhead light and held it hostage, a crooked gleam dancing along its fault line. The break wasn't from time or mishandling. It was surgical, like truth finally splitting through a lie that could no longer hold its shape. No one needed to ask where it came from. No one needed to ask whose it was. The number on the left fragment still sat like a scar, recorded, archived, eternal. Beside it, the metal was a contrast, but not a contradiction. Its dent spoke of contact, not carelessness. It had been struck, yes, but it had survived. Bent, but not broken. Maddox hadn't chosen a gleaming symbol of glory. She had chosen one that lasted. Wounded but whole, worn but upright. A symbol that didn't beg for reverence. It demanded understanding. The senator leaned forward slightly, elbows grazing the oak table, mouth opening just a fraction before thinking better of it. There were no questions to ask. Maddox had already answered everything. She had answered it in a posture, in restraint, in refusal, and, above all, in silence. To speak would be to contaminate. 2 rows back, a young woman in uniform swallowed hard. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from fear, but from the weight of watching a moment that she knew would follow her for the rest of her life. She didn't fully understand everything that had happened, all the policies, all the politics, all the fractures behind closed doors, but she understood what it meant to watch someone stand still when the world had begged them to break. And Maddox was doing it now, not through resistance, but presence. No page flipped. No aide moved. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. The entire system, built for debate and deliberation, had been momentarily suspended, not by power, but by clarity. And the longer the silence stretched, the louder it became. It filled the room not with explanation, but reflection. It turned inward. It demanded inwardness. She had brought no evidence, no timelines, no statistics, just 2 objects, and in doing so she exposed the entire infrastructure, not with accusation, but with implication. Because the truth was not that a general had been attacked in uniform. The truth was that no one had stopped it. The badge, cracked and incomplete, was not just a symbol of a failed officer. It was the system admitting it had never been whole. Maddox didn't move. Her shoulders remained square, her gaze somewhere far beyond the walls, not looking at the senators, not even listening for a response, because there wasn't one. There couldn't be. All that needed to be said was already on the table. And so, the silence held, kept its grip, grew stronger with each second it was allowed to live. The silence had become a presence unto itself, not passive, not polite, but oppressive in its dignity. It was no longer Maddox's silence alone. It had been transferred, absorbed by the chamber-like heat through steel. Every second that ticked by without a word deepened the incision, exposing the machinery underneath the ceremony. The badge and the medal did not sit quietly on the table. They radiated accusation through absence, through weight, through what they refused to explain. Brent Keller, though not in the room, would have felt it. The judgment without voice, the condemnation without spectacle. His name wasn't spoken, his face wasn't shown, but his legacy had been placed, split in 2, under 100 watching eyes. And the silence did what no testimony ever could. It named him without needing to utter a syllable. That broken badge didn't just belong to a man. It belonged to every unchecked moment, every ignored warning, every time a system chose protection over accountability. A senator adjusted his glasses, a twitch of discomfort betraying the erosion of confidence beneath his practiced neutrality. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. Witnesses came prepared with scripts, handlers, and talking points. They made statements, they asked for reform, they performed outrage, optimism, and remorse. But Maddox had rewritten the rules by refusing to perform at all. In a space that thrived on articulation, she had spoken a language that the institution was never built to handle. And that was the point. Across the country, televisions flickered with her image. News anchors stopped mid-sentence, unsure whether to narrate or wait. On streaming platforms and social media feeds, the broadcast spread like a pulse, raw, unedited, uninterrupted, no voiceover, no commentary, just her, standing, waiting, and walking away. But the walking hadn't come yet. She remained at the table, unmoving, as if daring the world to look at what it had made. 2 items, 1 story, infinite consequences. Her silence stretched into a kind of power that choked the room, not with violence, but with truth too heavy to ignore. People began to shift, subtly, almost involuntarily, knees crossing, throats tightening, fingers drumming against chairs. Not to fill the silence, but to survive it. because what had started as a gesture had evolved into the indictment, the kind no rebuttal could dilute, the kind that didn't fade when the cameras shut off. Maddox's back remained straight. Her hands rested at her sides. She did not blink, and in that stillness she said everything. And then, without fanfare, without warning, she stepped away from the table. No flourish, no nod, no dramatic pause for effect. She simply turned, fluid, composed, and walked toward the exit with the same deliberate precision she'd entered with. Her boots struck the marble floor with the cadence of finality, each step driving the silence deeper into the foundation of the room. She didn't glance back. She didn't acknowledge the stunned faces behind her. She didn't need to. Angela Maddox had come not to speak, but to end the conversation. Her exit carved something permanent into the air, a space that would never again be filled with noise. For a moment, the entire chamber remained frozen in her wake, not in confusion, in reverence, in reckoning, the kind of stillness reserved not for answers, but for aftermath. 2 minutes passed, not measured, felt, long enough for hearts to beat faster, for thoughts to clash, for defenses to collapse in silence, long enough for guilt to surface where denial once sat, long enough for her presence to sink into the bones of everyone in the room and stay there. The broken badge still lay in its spot, cold and absolute, a testimony written not in ink, but in fracture. The metal, bruised but whole, refused to shine. It didn't seek to inspire, it dared to remind. There was no gavel, no motion to adjourn, no closing remarks. Because how do you follow silence that speaks? Eventually someone stood, then another, then a third. Not in applause, not in protest, just upright, stunned into gravity by a woman who had dismantled a legacy not with anger, not with argument, but with presence. Brent Keller had once believed control was loud, that authority required teeth, fists, and bark. He had weaponized noise like armor. But Maddox had shown in those quiet moments that the most devastating blow is the one delivered without force, just truth, placed plainly and left to echo. Cameras continued to roll, but nothing more happened. No one spoke for the rest of the session, because what was left to say? The country had watched her walk in with history in her hands and leave it on the table. And that was the testimony. Time had been stilled, not forgotten. Brent Keller felt it the moment he turned the key and pushed open the door to his apartment. The hinges creaked like something warning him back, but he stepped through anyway. This place, once sterile and sharp-edged like him, now felt too quiet, too preserved. It was as if the walls had conspired to keep everything exactly as it was the day he lost control, because even the air hadn't moved since. There was no warmth in the space. It wasn't welcome. It tolerated. The lights were dim by default, as if they too had grown tired of performance. The leather chair in the corner, once shaped perfectly to his weight, now looked unfamiliar, too stiff, like it belonged to someone else. Brent took 3 slow steps in, and only then noticed the strange, uneasy weight hanging in the room. Not gravity, not dread, but something colder, stasis. The clock on the wall, just above the mantel, had stopped. Not slowed, not flickered, just stopped. He squinted at the hands. 8:46, the second hand had frozen mid-stroke, caught in the space between numbers like a breath too afraid to finish. He knew that time. Everyone in his world did. That had been the minute the formal call came through, the moment the precinct cut him loose, the exact moment when the system, without drama or debate, had decided it was done pretending he still belonged. The silence that followed that realization was neither poetic nor tragic. It was just factual, the kind of silence that made breathing sound performative. Brent stood and stared at the clock, not because it surprised him, but because of how unsurprising it felt. The clock had stopped when everything else did. It made perfect sense. His eyes shifted to the small calendar pinned crookedly to the fridge. One red line circled a date that now felt prehistoric. May 21st, the day after the incident. The last day he'd written anything down. The page hadn't been turned. The number hadn't changed. A month and a half had passed since, but here, inside these 4 walls, reality had been held hostage by the past. He didn't sigh, that would have required drama. He just moved forward. One hand reached for the back of the couch, steadying him, not from dizziness, but from the odd dissonance of re-entering a life that had already ended. Nothing had been cleaned, nothing had been rearranged. Dust curled at the corners of the photo frames. A cold cup of coffee, untouched since the morning he left for the disciplinary hearing, still sat on the table, rim stained with time and resignation. Brent crossed the room slowly, like someone walking through a scene left abandoned mid-conversation. He stepped over his own shadow, opened the closet, reached past the standard-issued uniforms that no longer belonged to him. There, in the back, under a collapsed cardboard box and a jacket that hadn't been worn since boot camp, was the suitcase. Not the sleek one used for business trips or formal visits, but the old one. Steel corners, cracked leather handle, the kind they don't manufacture anymore because no one needs to carry that kind of weight. He pulled it out. It scraped against the floor in protest. He lifted it onto the table and unlatched the rusted locks with a precision he hadn't forgotten. Inside, the air smelled like closed years, like denial zipped shut. Beneath a layer of plastic, folded with care he no longer remembered giving, was his military-issue uniform. Not the police one, not the one stained by newsreels and shame. This was older, harsher, less polished, the one he wore when he still believed that earning a title made a man. He stared at it. The green fabric was stiff with time. The shoulder seams had creased into sharp ridges. The insignia had faded, threads unraveling at the edges. His hand hovered above it, then landed gently. His fingers dragged slowly down the sleeve, across the chest. He found a small burn mark just beneath the collar. A lighter mishap, maybe, something meaningless at the time. Now it looked like a prophecy. He lifted the uniform from the case, held it at arm's length, as if distance could offer clarity. For a moment he tried to remember how it felt to wear it, before the ambition, before the bitterness, before the rot. But the memory wouldn't come. It had dried up somewhere between the courtrooms and the arrogance. He didn't know when exactly, just that it had. Then, in a voice he barely recognized as his own, Brent whispered into the empty apartment. I got it wrong from the start. The words didn't echo. They sank. The whisper dissipated into the still air, unacknowledged and unanswered, but Brent didn't expect a reply. The words had not been meant for the world, or even for her. They had been for the husk of a man who now stood holding a uniform that no longer fit, not in size, but in purpose. It felt like a costume now, not the armor of a soldier, but the shell of someone who once believed they were chosen, forged, necessary. He set the uniform down with a kind of respect he never gave it in life. Back then, he had treated it as a launch pad, something to get through, to surpass. He didn't see it as a calling, he saw it as a transaction, a means to another identity, the one with flashing lights, control over crowds, the license to command with nothing but tone and presence. That's what he'd wanted, authority without self-awareness, power without pause. And now, stripped of all of it, the truth lay bare on the table in cotton, faded green, and broken stitching. He moved through the apartment like a ghost returning to the scene of its undoing. Each object he touched gave no comfort. A cracked photo frame of his academic graduation, a rusted nameplate shoved into a drawer, a copy of a commendation he'd once hung proudly on the wall, now leaned behind the television, warped from where it had fallen and never been picked up. These were not souvenirs. They were remnants, fossils of belief systems that had gone extinct. The clock continued not to tick. He stood beneath it, watching the unmoving second hand with a dull fixation, as though sheer attention might will it forward again. It didn't. It hung there, suspended, indifferent, much like the man who had once believed his movement made the world move. There had been a time he would have replaced the battery instantly. Time meant momentum. Momentum meant purpose. But now, the silence of the room made its refusal to tick feel appropriate, honest. Brent sat down, slow, careful, as if not to disturb the detritus of his myth. The suitcase remained open on the table beside him, uniform resting on its edge like a sentence never delivered. He stared at it, not longing, not grief, just the simple acknowledgement that this was where it started. Before Maddox, before the badge, before the street and the cameras and the blood. This uniform, this moment, was the origin point of the man he'd become. And it had started wrong. There was no great betrayal, no trauma to blame, just the slow, ego-fed corrosion of someone who had mistaken fear for respect. He remembered the way he used to command a room, not by insight, not by leadership, but by volume, by threat. He had believed decisiveness was dominance, that silence from subordinates meant loyalty, not terror. He'd carried that belief through every rank, every post, every confrontation, until the day it collided with a woman who didn't flinch. Angela Maddox had not screamed, had not cursed, had not retaliated. She had absorbed every ounce of his fury, his authority, and returned nothing. No crack, no plea, just her spine, straight as steel, and her silence, louder than anything he'd ever shouted. And now here he sat, surrounded by the artifacts of a man who had won so many arguments but never once reflected. His failures weren't buried, they were framed, and yet no one was coming to dig them up. That was the bitter grace of obscurity. The world had moved on, but he had become trapped in the moment the clocks stopped. His gaze drifted back to the calendar. The date, circled in red, stared back at him with a kind of mockery. The irony was sharp. He had marked that day with expectation. It was supposed to be the beginning of his reinstatement, the day he walked back into his old life with a smirk and a suit, smugly vindicated. But the system hadn't hesitated. It had cut him loose, quietly, finally. And now the page remained unturned, unresolved, irrelevant. He stood again, crossed to the mantel, and reached up for the stopped clock. The plastic frame felt brittle in his hands, lighter than he remembered. He held it for a moment, turning it over to inspect the back. The battery hatch hung open. No battery inside, just a hollow compartment where something vital was meant to be, like him. He didn't speak. There was no epiphany coming, no swelling of music in his chest, only the faint, dry sound of something breaking far beneath the surface, soft, inevitable, old. He placed the clock face down on the table next to the uniform. The second hand, now hidden, would no longer mock him, not by moving, not by stopping, just by being unnecessary. The table now held both the past and the proof of how far he'd drifted from anything worth following. The stopped clock, the old uniform, the hollow silence of a room that no longer knew his name. These things weren't metaphors. They were material. They were facts. And Brent Keller, who once measured himself in rank, orders, and compliance, now measured himself in absence. He crossed to the small cabinet near the window, a piece of furniture he'd ignored for years. Inside were items he once considered irrelevant, letters from former colleagues, training certificates, unused medals in cheap velvet boxes. He pulled open the drawer, letting the dust puff into the air like breath from a long-dead thing. Papers slid around beneath his fingers, but nothing called to him. Nothing offered redemption or even confrontation, just paper and metal, stripped of authority by the knowledge that none of it had stopped him from becoming what he was now, discarded. He closed the drawer gently and walked back toward the couch. His eyes passed over the walls again, but now even the cracks in the paint seemed to avoid him. Everything in this apartment, this carefully staged life, had become a set piece to a story no one was telling anymore. He stood in the center, no longer protagonist, no longer villain, just unrevived, unspoken, unneeded. The voice in his head, the one that used to bark orders, craft explanations, spit justifications with surgical control, had gone quiet. It no longer tried to rewrite the past. It didn't try to blame Maddox, the system, the cadets who couldn't take the pressure, the regulations that had gone soft. All of that was gone, not because he had seen the light, because he had finally run out of shadow to hide behind. He sat again, not slouched, not defeated, but with the posture of a man who knew the weight of stillness. The uniform sat in his lap, creased, dry, heavier now than when he wore it under live fire. He ran his fingers along the inside tag, tracing the faded serial number stitched in red. That number used to mean something. It used to be proof that he belonged to something larger than himself, but now it felt like a mark, a reminder that once, long ago, someone trusted him enough to give him purpose, and he had traded that trust for control. He rested the uniform across his knees, palms flat against the rough fabric, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, not even to shut the world out, but to stop seeing his name attached to things it no longer deserved to be part of. He breathed in, slowly, and for the first time in days, weeks, maybe months, he didn't brace for noise. There would be no calls, no visits, no last chances. The system had already cast its verdict. And the truth was, this silence, the kind that lingered after relevance had gone, was exactly what he had earned. He opened his eyes and glanced at the clock again, still face down. He didn't move to fix it. He didn't even want to, because somewhere in the frozen second hand and the batteryless back, he saw something truer than any polished speech or forced apology. The precise, irreversible moment where he stopped moving forward, and no gear, no rank, no decorated past could restart him. Not anymore. The air in the apartment had thickened, not with heat, not with dust, but with that invisible heaviness that settles when every illusion has finally collapsed. Brent Keller sat still, back straight but no longer rigid. There was no parade left in him, no theater of the absurd, just stillness. Not the kind that waited for redemption, but the kind that had stopped asking for anything at all. He looked at the uniform in his lap again as if it might say something. It didn't. The green threads didn't shimmer with past glory. They didn't ache for return. They just existed, mute, worn, familiar, in the way guilt becomes when you've lived with it long enough. He folded the jacket slowly, aligning the sleeves with care, tucking the collar down as if preparing it for burial, not storage. It had once been a beginning. Now it was just a body of fabric, laid down like memory. He rose from the couch, walked to the suitcase, and placed the uniform back inside. His movements were precise, not ceremonial, but intentional, as if the act itself deserved a kind of respect, not for who he was, but for the moment he could finally admit what he would never be. He stood there, staring at the open suitcase, then closed the lid gently, latching the locks one by one. The final click echoed in the room like punctuation, not on a sentence, but on a sentence served. Behind him, the wall clock remained face down. The calendar still hung untouched, its red circle marking a day that never came. He walked to the calendar and tore the page off in a single, slow pull. He didn't flip it, he didn't replace it. He simply dropped it to the floor where it fluttered down in silence and landed face up, still showing the same date, refusing to let go. Brent left it there. Some truths aren't meant to be erased, just left behind. He moved to the far corner of the room, where a small mirror once hung, now gone. The nail still stuck out of the wall, crooked and rusted, holding nothing. Another reminder. He had used to check that mirror every morning before stepping out, tightening his collar, adjusting the tilt of his badge, smirking to himself as if the reflection proved something. He stood there now, looking into the nothing that replaced it, and saw more of himself than he ever had. No one would knock on his door. No one would call with a second chance. And deep down, Brent didn't want one. Not because he believed he had paid his debt, but because he finally understood that some debts don't end. They just change form. They stop asking for an apology and start living in silence, in clocks that no longer move, in calendars that refuse to turn, in uniforms too heavy to wear again. He walked to the window and stared out. The city moved on below, cars passing, lights shifting, people unaware or uncaring that a man above them had finally collapsed in the most unremarkable way, by sitting still and admitting to himself, in a voice no one would ever hear, that the world had kept turning without him. That was supposed to. Brent Keller stepped back from the glass. The apartment didn't protest. It didn't judge. It just stood there, unchanged, unfeeling, a perfect reflection of the man who had once commanded rooms with his voice and now could barely command his breath. He turned off the light, sat down once more, and listened to nothing, because nothing was all that remained. The silence hadn't lifted. It had simply moved with him, like a thread stitched beneath his skin, pulling taut with every step he took outside the apartment. Brent Keller no longer walked like someone expecting acknowledgement. There was no chin held high, no squared shoulders. He moved with the quiet inertia of a man who understood too late that momentum does not equal meaning. It was late afternoon when he turned down a side street in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, either because it had changed or because he had never truly seen it before. The buildings were a patchwork of time, some newly painted, others cracked and flaking. Dust curled at the edges of the sidewalk like loose thoughts. And then he saw it. A shop, not the kind with neon or polish, just glass windows behind rusted frames, the name barely legible above the door. It didn't advertise anything. It didn't need to. The kind of people who entered knew what it was. Old things for small cash. Value is measured not in history but in utility, or the lack of it. Brent slowed. There was a display case in the window. Inside, beneath a dull pane streaked with fingerprints and sunlight, sat a collection of items tossed together without reverence. Cracked lighters, pocket knives, a tangle of dog tags, half a compass, a chipped coffee mug with a city seal barely visible, and in the middle, crooked against a folded napkin, was a badge. He knew it instantly, not just by shape or number or patina, by feel. It was the same make, the same issue, as the one he had carried for years like a shield and a sword. Not a replica, not a toy, a real badge, just like his. Maybe it had been his. The thought crept in without permission. It didn't matter. What mattered was how it looked now. No shine, no polish, just dull metal, edges scuffed, emblem worn flat, lettering barely legible beneath grime. It didn't gleam with authority, it slouched with neglect. He stood outside the glass, staring, unmoving. Something about it, how it had ended up here, next to a 50-cent lighter and a cracked snow globe, sank into his chest like cold water. Then the voice came, casual and sharp. "Nothing in that case is worth more than $1, the shop owner said, stepping into view from behind the counter inside. He was older, uninterested, half bored. "That badge? Been sitting there for months. Nobody wants it. Tin like that doesn't mean anything anymore." The words cut clean. Brent didn't flinch. He didn't look at the man. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, letting the sentence settle in the space between them. It doesn't mean anything anymore. Not tarnished, not controversial, just worthless. Was heard by it, and the man who had once worn it like a mantle of judgment, whose voice could make a room stop breathing, was now no more than a reflection in a dirty storefront window, watching a symbol of everything he thought he was, reduced to a rusted relic, buried in clutter. He didn't go inside. There was nothing left to retrieve. The badge behind the glass said it all. Brent didn't need the man's voice to confirm what he already knew. He stood there, staring at the hollow emblem once wrapped around his identity, and felt nothing rise to defend it. No rebuttal, no fire. Just a quiet, irreversible knowing it was over. Not just the job, not just the reputation, the meaning, the weight. It had rusted along with the tin. Meanwhile, the world kept moving and watching. The video didn't come from a government agency or a major news network. It came from a young woman with editing software, a Twitter account, and a clarity of perspective that no institution could manufacture. The clip, barely 4 minutes long, appeared without fanfare on a Tuesday night, tagged only, "Compare for yourself." But by morning it had flooded every feed in the country. Split screen, left side, Angela Maddox, silent, from the first moment on the street to the last step out of the congressional hearing room. No narration, just images. Her uniform, her eyes, her breath, steady. She stood while blood slid from her face. She stood while her badge was crushed underfoot. She stood while questions were asked, cameras rolled, and chaos spun around her like debris in a storm. The only sound, city wind and far-off sirens, and the slow, inevitable clicks of her boots on tile. Right side, Brent Keller, spiraling, grainy body cam footage. Cell phone clips, newsroom zooms, his voice rising, breaking and snarling. "You think that uniform makes you untouchable? Answer me. Don't look at me like that." He slammed his baton against metal. He yelled in courtrooms. He hissed through teeth clenched around frustration he mistook for authority. Each clip stacked one over the other like hammer blows. Volume increasing, dignity collapsed. No commentary, no headlines, just two timelines unspooling side by side. Maddox's restraint, Keller's unraveling. Her stillness, his combustion. Her presence, his performance. Within an hour, the video had been re-uploaded to 5 platforms. By noon, it was breaking national engagement records. No filters, no voiceovers, just contrast, just the truth. A comment rose to the top beneath the video, shared, reposted, quoted again and again. She won because she didn't have to shout. It wasn't praise, it wasn't hero worship, it was recognition. A nation that had grown desensitized to volume finally paused for silence and saw, maybe for the first time, what real power looks like, not in command, but in control, not in retaliation, but in refusal. News anchors tried to keep up, but nothing they said matched the resonance of that one sentence. She won. Not because the system declared it, not because anyone crowned her, but because, in the face of everything, she had never abandoned herself. She hadn't explained, she hadn't pleaded, she had stood. Clips of Brent circulated too, but now they landed differently, not as outrage but as caution. He was no longer the center of the story. He was its shadow, the echo of a system that had finally stopped pretending yelling was leadership, the image of a man who mistook noise for justice and collapsed the moment silence didn't back down. Maddox never stated the video. She didn't share it, she didn't acknowledge it, she didn't need to. The world had already written its response, and this time it wasn't in shouts. It was in the still quiet that follows when truth has been laid bare and no one dares look away. The screen faded to black. The video had ended, but its silence reverberated louder than any breaking headline. The comment, "She won," because she didn't have to shout, lingered in the bloodstream of a nation that had learned to fear quiet until now. Across living rooms, phones, offices, and barracks, that quiet was becoming something else entirely, reverence. And while the world debated, posted, and reacted, one place chose not to echo, but to embody. It was a bright morning at the National Military Academy. The courtyard, clean and austere, gleamed beneath a sun too bold for the hush it presided over. Rows of cadets, young, sharp, unmoved by distraction, stood in formation, their boots planted into stone like declarations. Today was Oath Day, and at the center of the square, raised high on the gray facade of the command hall, was a portrait that needed no caption, no gold frame, no decorative flair, just the image of Angela V. Maddox, face forward, eyes unblinking, a single streak of dried blood along the temple of her pressed uniform. It was the moment frozen from the morning Brent Keller had broken everything. She hadn't posed, she hadn't spoken. The photo had simply captured the truth at full volume. Off her head, bold letters carved into steel read, "Don't raise your voice, raise your presence." There was no applause, no flags waved, no slogans rang out, just the sharp sound of breath drawn in sync. The command called to attention and a generation of young women stepping forward, hands raised, voices steady. They swore not to be feared but to be trusted, not to command through force but through unshakable clarity. And when they lowered their hands, their eyes didn't flick to the crowd or the press pit lining the side. They lifted almost as one, toward the image above, toward the woman who had taught them that silence, when earned, could be absolute. Brent stood in the shadow of the farthest pillar, just beyond the boundary line where civilians were expected to stop. He wore no uniform, no badge, nothing that gave him shape in this place. He could have passed for anyone, except no one else stood like that. Not still, not bowed, just still, like he didn't belong, and he knew it. He had arrived early, earlier than necessary. He told himself it was curiosity, that he just wanted to witness how far the narrative had spun, but deep down he knew. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the space he no longer occupied. From this distance, he could see her expression in the portrait rendered larger than life. Her eyes didn't accuse. They didn't forgive. They simply observed. The same way they had that morning, after the baton, after the blood, after the badge hit the ground. She had looked at him as if she saw not just what he had done, but what he had chosen to become, and she had refused to meet him there. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how long he had been standing without moving. But still, he didn't step forward. He couldn't. Not out of fear, he was well past that, but because approaching would imply an expectation, and Brent Keller had finally come to terms with the truth. He was no longer owed an answer. This wasn't his story anymore. It had never really been. Maddox had never tried to convince anyone of her worth. She hadn't fought to reclaim her reputation. She hadn't issued clarifications or explanations. All she had done was stand, and in that stillness, she had built something larger than any of them could tear down. Brent looked again at the line of cadets. One girl, tall, brown-skinned, her chin tilted just slightly upward, stood closest to the podium. There was something in her posture, something unmistakable. She didn't mimic Maddox. She embodied her, not with imitation, but with that same refusal to be bent. As the instructor stepped away and the flag team lowered their banners, the cadet turned her head and glanced at the image above them just for a second. And in that second, Brent knew he was watching the future nod to the legend, and then move on without needing her to explain herself. He took one step back, then another, and another. The second step backward felt heavier than the first. Not physically, but in a way Brent couldn't name, as if the air itself had thickened, pushing against his retreat, silently judging his presence. He didn't belong here, and every inch he moved away was a confirmation of that truth. He wasn't retreating from a battlefield or abandoning a post. No, this was something more profound. He was stepping away from relevance, from history being written without him, from a world that had already absorbed his mistakes and closed the door behind them. A breeze stirred through the courtyard, lifting the edges of crisp cadet uniforms, brushing over stone like a whisper of something sacred. It didn't disturb the formation. These girls didn't flinch. They had learned something deeper than discipline. They had learned silence as a weapon, presence as power. Brent studied them, not with envy, but with an aching kind of clarity. They weren't copies, they weren't symbols, they were proof. Proof that Maddox's silence had birthed not just outrage, but inheritance. He watched as an officer, female, sharp eyes, calm voice, moved along the front row, pinning insignia to chests with a firm press and a nod. There was no fanfare. No applause, just that exacting stillness. When the officer reached the last cadet, she stepped back, saluted, and left them standing at full attention beneath the steel-carved words behind them. No one needed to say what they meant. They meant everything. Brent's gaze wandered back to the portrait. There were no accolades etched beneath Maddox's name, no campaign ribbons or glowing summaries, just her face, unmoving, unbroken, unshaken, and that single command: don't raise your voice, raise your presence. He thought about the voices he had raised, the threats, the courtroom snarls, the hallway outbursts, and where had it brought him? To this pillar, in this shadow, unnoticed and uninvited. It wasn't shame that kept him here, it was understanding. Finally and irreversibly he saw the line drawn. Maddox didn't need to destroy him. She didn't have to speak against him. She had stood still, and time had done the rest. A memory flickered, one he hadn't let himself revisit until now. Years ago, during his first weeks as an officer, Brent had stood before a group of rookies in a precinct training room. He tapped the badge on his chest and said, "This is your voice now. You don't shout, you enforce." But it had been a lie. He had shouted. He had forced. And when that didn't work, he'd crushed, until even the badge lost meaning. He rubbed his palm against his jaw and let his fingers fall to his side. In front of him, a group of parents began to gather near the gates, quiet and reverent. They held cameras, but didn't raise them. Somehow they understood that this moment wasn't for capturing, it was for carrying. It belonged to the cadets. It belonged to the silence. It belonged to her. Brent shifted again, half turning, ready to leave. But then he saw the girl again, the tall one near the front. She stepped down from the platform with the others, falling into line, her movements clean and unhesitant. As she turned, her eyes swept across the space and landed for a heartbeat in his direction. She didn't react. She didn't flinch or recognize or judge. She simply looked and then looked away. It was worse than if she'd glared, worse than if she'd whispered his name. She didn't see him as part of this. He didn't exist in her world. He turned fully now, the portrait of Maddox disappearing from view behind the granite edge of the command building. He felt the loss of it in his chest, not like heartbreak, but like breath exhaled after holding it too long. This wasn't punishment, it was perspective. Maddox hadn't exiled him, she had simply continued forward without needing to acknowledge his weight, and everyone else had followed. That was her power. Not that she stood above them, but that she didn't have to look back. Brent walked, not in haste, not in shame, just walked, past the outer edge of the courtyard, past the low metal barricades, past the line of visitors still arriving, with careful steps and folded programs. The wind pressed against his coat, tugging at it as if to remind him that he still hadn't let go completely. But he didn't look back, not yet. Maybe not ever. Something in him understood now that turning back wouldn't undo anything. Some stories didn't offer redemption arcs. Some only ended when you stopped demanding one. Across the street, tucked between a war memorial and a quiet chapel, stood a narrow bench facing the academy's granite front. Brant sat down, alone but not hidden, and let the stillness settle into his bones. His eyes traced the crowd beyond the gate, where young women in polished boots and ironed collars clustered under the shade of a flag at half-mast, not mourning death, marking transformation. The flag didn't weep, it bore witness. He watched them speak in low voices, the kind that didn't need to be heard to carry weight. Some pointed upward at Maddox's portrait, others didn't need to. They already knew it by heart. That image had spread beyond this campus. It had become a screensaver, an emblem, a protest symbol, a recruitment poster, not because of marketing, but because of momentum. Maddox didn't demand loyalty, she earned gravity, and gravity did not need volume. Brent leaned back against the bench, the wood cool through his jacket. His hands rested in his lap, empty, no weapon, no badge, no purpose, just skin and silence. A lifetime ago, he would have stood on that platform, bellowing orders, demanding compliance. Now, no one would have listened, not because they hated him, but because they had outgrown him. A group of new cadets marched across the plaza in formation. Uniform, precise, determined. Their faces were unreadable, but not cold, controlled, intentional. They didn't walk like they wanted to prove something. They walked like they already belonged, like they understood that strength didn't need to announce itself. Brent watched as the line slowed near the central flagstone, an engraved star marking the core of the campus. The first cadet in the row paused for half a beat, her boot resting beside the star's edge, and glanced up at the building. Just 1 second, and then she moved on. No salute, no flourish, just acknowledgement, as if the air itself carried meaning too deep for words. That was what Maddox had taught them, not with doctrine, not with rhetoric, with presence, with restraint. Brent had mocked that word once. He remembered it vividly, his voice dripping sarcasm during a training seminar. Restraint just gets you overpowered. But it hadn't been restraint that got Maddox hurt. It had been his unchecked pride, his assumption that silence meant weakness, that control was cowardice, that authority had to be shouted to be real. Now across this campus, he saw the truth bloom in every disciplined step and unspoken vow. They didn't need to shout, they didn't need to react, they just needed to be. And he didn't even cast a shadow that reached their feet. The bell from the far side of the academy struck once, sharp, metallic, and absolute. It echoed through the morning like the punctuation mark on an era. Brent flinched slightly, not because of the sound, but because of what it marked. Finality. There would be no more footage, no more apologies to fake, no tribunal to manipulate, just this, her legacy carved into the living, into the daily rituals of a future that would never wear his fate. He stood, not out of obligation, but because there was nothing left to sit for. The bench creaked as he moved away, boots scuffing the pavement. He adjusted his coat with a practiced motion, useless now, like muscle memory from a life stripped of meaning. Across the street, the cadets were dispersing, not chaotically, but with quiet intent. Some removed their gloves, others folded their programs. A few remained beneath Maddox's portrait, gazing up in still reverence. Brent's steps slowed as he reached the crosswalk, the campus still within view. One last time, he looked toward the face on that wall, Angela Maddox, fixed in time, unspeaking but undeniable. The quote above her wasn't just carved into the building, it was etched into this generation's spine. Don't raise your voice, raise your presence. He felt the finality of that sentence like a door closing gently but firmly behind him. He would never be invited inside again. A small group of high school girls, escorted by a young instructor, passed by him as he lingered near the curb. They barely registered him. Just another civilian, another shadow. But one of the girls, 15, maybe 16, stopped for a moment, looked up at the building, then whispered, "She never shouted." And still, they listened. Her voice was not defiant, it was curious. It carried no hatred, no judgment, just wonder. Brent didn't speak, he didn't interrupt, he didn't correct. He had no ground to stand on anymore. He waited until they disappeared around the corner, then turned his back to the building for the final time. As he walked away, the wind picked up, soft but persistent, lifting the edges of flyers taped to lampposts, rippling the Academy's flag in slow, solemn waves. The world moved on, not with force, but with certainty. And Brent understood, deeply and finally, that silence had done what all his shouting never could. It lasted, and somewhere behind him, under the weight of all that silence, a new kind of strength was being sworn into the bones of the next. They would not need to yell, they would not need to fight to be heard. They had Maddox, and Maddox had never answered because she never had to.